I don't think that Mr. David Sanger needs another introduction since he had his yesterday. So without any further ado, I will call on him to...
Thanks. I'm going to use the podium up here. Worked yesterday, see if it works today. So I'll be brief since I'm the last thing between all of you and your lunch, and that's never a good place for a speaker to be. So you've heard a bit now about what Israel's undeclared weapons program has brought it. You've heard a bit about India and Pakistan's, and I would agree with most of what you've got there. The North Koreans have very little doubt that nuclear weapons are the reason that they still exist. That if it was not for nuclear weapons, North Korea would be a small flick on the map that we thought about on World Food Day. And to their minds, it's only nuclear weapons that give them any influence in the world. It's only nuclear weapons that have kept them from being overrun. It's only nuclear weapons that assure that it doesn't make that big a difference whether the Chinese are angry at them, as they seem to be with increasing frequency. And when they look out at the world over the past 10 years, the conclusion they come to is that if the United States really wanted them to give up nuclear weapons, the U.S. would not have acted as it has acted. They look at the world with two big events in the past decade. One of them was the invasion of Iraq in 2003. And their interpretation of that event was that while the United States used a developing nuclear weapons program to justify the attack, had the U.S. thought that Iraq actually had weapons, we wouldn't have attacked. And that the U.S. was driven very much by the discovery in Iraq of a pretty advanced nuclear weapons program right after the Persian Gulf War, and did not want to be in that situation again. So their overall view of Saddam Hussein was he got what he had coming to him by moving too slowly on weapons. Then came Libya, a country that gave up a very nascent program in the end of 2003, turned over its centrifuges, basically did everything the United States has been urging North Korea to do for the past 20 years. We sent visitors to Libya. Tony Blair went. Condoleezza Rice went. Many delegations went to go encourage Muammar Gaddafi to integrate with the West. Exactly what the U.S. would promise to do for North Korea if it gave up nuclear weapons. And when that moment came that the Libyan people turned against Gaddafi, the United States and the Europeans immediately sided with the uprising, bombed Gaddafi, and ultimately drove him to the point where he was pulled out of a ditch and shot. Their lesson from that one? Somewhere in that run across the country that lasted 5 or 6 months, some evening, Muammar Gaddafi must have stopped and thought to himself, gee, maybe giving away all those centrifuges back to the United States and the IAEA wasn't the brightest thing I ever did. And so they have emerged from those two experiences, I think, more convinced than ever that nuclear weapons are critical to their survival. Whether we think they're destabilizing doesn't really make a big difference. Kim Jong-un, if anything, has doubled down. And the evidence that he has doubled down is pretty strong. Just in the past 6 months, we've seen a slew of new estimates about how many weapons North Korea may well have by, say, 2020. If you assume that they have somewhere between 8 and a dozen now, the guess is by 2020 they will probably have 20. There are some high-end estimates that by 2050 they could have 100. That, in other words, their goal is to get up to a Pakistani, Indian, Israel level. You see this to some degree in what has blocked the resumption of any kinds of talks with the West. The North Korean position is, their going-in position, is that they will have arms control talks, essentially. And the American and South Korean position, bolstered to some degree by the Russians, the Japanese, the Chinese, is that these discussions have to be about ultimately denuclearizing the Korean Peninsula. And since the North Koreans go into it saying, thanks, that isn't the objective of the talks, the U.S. and to some degree the South Koreans have been understandably reluctant to enter the talks at all, because we don't even have a common agreement about what the ultimate objective is. If North Korea actually did have 20 weapons in 2020, the next president of the United States is going to have a real problem on their hands. Because while we can sit and argue about how good their missiles are, and right now the safest place to be standing when North Korea conducts a missile test is wherever they're aiming the missile. But their aim will get better over time. Their ability to shrink the warhead is clearly improving a bit. And it's very easy to assume that the next American president may well face the possibility that North Korea could demonstrate that it would have a weapon that was capable of hitting someplace on the west coast of the United States, maybe with low accuracy, and that they would be presumed to have the capability, some of the military, U.S. military believe they already do, to shrink a warhead enough that it could fit atop that missile. That would change the nature of the strategic calculus for any American president. Especially because if you think about the other presentations we've seen today on Israel, on Pakistan, on India, we understand a little bit of the deterrence back and forth, particularly even with India, Pakistan. Wild as the rhetoric gets, I think you made a convincing case that the two sides have an understanding a little bit of each other's doctrine now. We have none of that in the North Korean case. We don't understand very much about Kim Jong-un. 2 years ago, the assumption was that he was a mixed-up 28 to 30-year-old who was the pawn of the generals, including the uncle who was supposed to make sure that he stayed on the straight and narrow. The uncle is no longer among us. And there is almost no doubt right now that Kim Jong-un has used the most brutal tactics to make sure that he has sole control. I mean, organizing executions using an anti-aircraft gun, visible by satellite, and inviting villagers out to witness the execution is not exactly subtle, but so far it appears to have been effective. So that takes us to the question, if in fact Kim Jong-un regards nuclear weapons as critical to his own perception of regime security, what have we done so far to undercut that? And the answer is not very much. The Obama administration, I think, came in believing that they might engage North Korea the way they've engaged Myanmar, the way they've engaged Cuba, and whether you think it's been a good idea or a bad idea, the way they've engaged Iran. North Korea is a real outlier case. When the North Koreans conducted their first nuclear test of the Obama administration, it was just 6 months in, less than 6 months into the administration itself. So you had a new president who gave an inaugural address announcing the outstretched hand. Some people sent cables, some people sent postcards. The North Koreans sent a congratulatory note that was a nuclear test. That turned everybody in the Obama White House into a North Korea hawk. And the attitudes that you heard in year 1 have really not changed in year 6 or 7. Now, here in Israel, North Korea serves a very important rhetorical role. It is the comparison that the prime minister uses to say, if you fail with Iran, you will end up with North Korea. And it's an interesting, effective one, because most people who think about nuclear weapons and the states that create them lump North Korea and Iran together as if they were the combined syllables of a single country. In fact, as many here at INSS have written, these programs are very different. Let's run through just a very short list of the differences. The agreement in 1994 with North Korea that was supposed to limit their program was 3 pages long. And it was remarkably unspecific. And if you looked at it today, you would call it pretty naive. Naive in that the absence of specificity seemed to be based on the thought that North Korea, in fact, had some goodwill about executing this program. And remember, the program in '94 was initially negotiated with Kim Il-sung, the grandfather of the current leader. In contrast, the Iran agreement, should we see one next week or the week after that, or however long we're all stuck in Vienna watching this process, will be enormously long. There are several annexes plus the actual agreement. It's incredibly detailed. And that doesn't necessarily mean any of it will work, but it tells you that these agreements are of a very different kind. Second, the Iranians seem quite persuaded that their best strategy is to stay inside the NPT. If you believe that they are cheating on it, to do what's called cheating from within. If you believe they're actual signatories and they're doing what they're supposed to do, then you would believe that they don't have a nuclear weapons intent, but instead may be legally building up a capability. But in any case, they don't want to have the opprobrium that has come on the North Koreans when the North Koreans made that decision to go do the one thing you need to do to get out of the NPT, which is mail a postcard to the IAEA and say, I'm out. And 6 months later, you're out. So that's a very large difference. The third is national objective. Many in Iran, maybe not the Ayatollah after his speech last night, maybe not the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, but most of the population craves integration. They want to go to American and European universities. They want the freedom to travel. They want to be able to spend money. They want to be able to go to Western movies. When you talk to Iranian young people, they are the biggest Western admirers you can possibly imagine. The North Korean leadership, at least, we don't know very much about the populace, craves isolation. The Iranians say they don't want a weapon. The North Koreans revel in having a weapon, because the weapon is almost their equivalent of a ring fence around the country to keep everybody else out. I remember one time, more than a decade ago, traveling around South Korea with Tom Friedman, our columnist, and Tom and I were talking over dinner one night about what the right analogy was for North Korea, and in the end we decided that what it was the one house in the middle of a very rapidly gentrifying neighborhood where the owner won't sell and is sitting in there quite cranky and has built this giant barbed wire fence and has rigged his entire house with TNT and threatened to blow up the entire lovely neighborhood unless somebody brought him takeout every night. And basically what was happening, at least until a year or two ago, was someone in the neighborhood was always bringing them takeout. Whether it was the Chinese supplying oil or someone else, they all were coming in to try to do anything they could to keep them from triggering the explosives around the house because it would blow up the very nice neighborhood. So, what does that tell us about our central question here? Does a nuclear weapon enhance a country's perception of its security? No one likes to admit this, but in the North Korean case, I think there is very little doubt that without nuclear weapons, nobody would have been bringing them takeout. Nobody would have cared. They would have waited for them to implode. And when they imploded, Samsung, Daewoo, everybody else would be ready to roll right over the border, set up their factories, and be ready to go. So it's not a great example for those who want to make the case that nonproliferation is a shared goal around the world. Our strategy against North Korea has largely failed. We have a Castro strategy against North Korea at this point. We are waiting for God to solve this problem. Every American president since Harry Truman has been convinced that North Korea would collapse on his watch. If Kim Jong-un can hold out for just another 18 months, he will have done what the rest of the Kim family has done successfully since 1952. He will have disappointed every American president since Harry Truman. Without nuclear weapons, I'm not sure that would have been entirely possible. So where does that leave us and the next American president? First, we clearly need a strategy, because whatever it is we're doing isn't working. If you think of the first term of the Bush administration as a strategy of starving the North Koreans until they collapse, which was essentially the Cheney approach when he said we don't negotiate with evil, we defeat it, well, they managed to get by on very little food. If you think about the second Bush administration term, second term, which was negotiate with them, well, the deal didn't survive very long into the Obama era. If you think of the Obama strategy, which is fundamentally ignore them, refuse to, as Bob Gates said, sell them the same horse, or I'm sorry, buy the same horse all over again, that has not succeeded terribly well. So we need a series of disincentives for the Chinese and to a lesser degree the Russians to keep them up and running and alive. And I don't blame the Chinese right now for not wanting to have South Korea and the United States up on the North Korea-Chinese border. I mean, you can imagine why, as the Chinese look at this, it's not in their national interest, much as they say they don't want North Korea to have a nuclear weapon. They really, really don't want to have South Korea and the U.S. right on their border. They would prefer to have an unstable nuclear weapons state instead of that. There's no other way to interpret their behavior over the past 10 years other than that, I think. So on that cheery note, I will sit down. I don't know if we have time left for questions before we make our way to lunch, but thank you very much.
Thank you.